A routine grocery store visit takes a dramatic turn when an elderly woman tells a young black man to go back to Africa. His response doesn't just silence the room, it changes everything. The store buzzed with the usual activity of shoppers maneuvering their carts through the aisles. Some were deep in thought, while others conversed in hushed tones. It was a bright afternoon in a small Ohio neighborhood, a place where most people knew each other. But on this particular day, the familiar rhythm of daily life was about to be disrupted in the most unexpected way. Near the produce section, an elderly woman, likely in her late 70s, stood adjusting her glasses. She seemed impatient, murmuring under her breath as she reached for a bag of apples. Her faded cardigan and neatly pinned silver hair gave her an unassuming appearance, but what happened next was anything but ordinary. A young black man, tall and casually dressed in a blue hoodie and jeans, approached the same display, reaching for a bag of oranges. His name was Daryl. He exuded a quiet politeness, blending seamlessly into the flow of the store as he balanced a grocery basket in one hand and scrolled through his phone with the other. Then it happened. The elderly woman turned abruptly, her expression shifting the moment she noticed Daryl. Her narrowed eyes and pursed lips made her thoughts clear even before she spoke. "You people don't belong here," she said, loud enough for those nearby to hear. Daryl's fingers hovered over his phone as he froze. When he looked up, she continued, her tone sharp and unwavering. "Why don't you go back to Africa, where you came from?" The atmosphere shifted instantly. The murmur of the store came to a halt, replaced by an uneasy silence. A few shoppers stopped in their tracks. Some exchanged uncomfortable glances, while others pretended not to have heard. The weight of the moment pressed down on everyone. Daryl's first reaction was shock. His brow furrowed, and for a brief second, it seemed like he might respond immediately. But he didn't. Instead, he took a slow, steady breath, his face unreadable as if carefully considering his next move. The elderly woman, still clutching her apples, stood firm, unapologetic in her stance. The tension in the air was undeniable. A young mother quietly guided her child away, while an older man near the potatoes stole a nervous glance at Daryl, waiting to see what he would do next. The silence that followed was thick and heavy. For a moment, Daryl stood motionless, gripping the handle of his basket as if grounding himself. The world around him seemed to shrink, every sound in the store muffled, every eye fixed on him. The woman's words hung in the air like an inescapable stench. She didn't waver. Her posture was defiant, as though expecting no argument. With a huff, she adjusted her cardigan and lifted her chin, silently daring him to respond. A young employee stacking bananas a few feet away hesitated mid-motion, uncertain whether to intervene. A cashier leaned forward, craning her neck for a better view. The crowd that had begun to form didn't step closer, but they didn't disperse either. Like it or not, they were now witnesses. Daryl met the woman's gaze, his expression calm but thoughtful. 1,000 responses raced through his mind. He could yell, walk away, or retaliate, but none of those felt right. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, yet instead of reacting impulsively, he took a deep breath and straightened his posture. His presence seemed to expand, commanding attention in the thick silence. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady and deliberate, cutting through Malathur. "Terminci. Ma'am," he began, his tone measured, "do you even realize what you just said?" His question wasn't confrontational, but reflective, almost as if he was giving her a chance to reconsider her words. But she showed no sign of reflection. "I said what I said," she snapped, her voice rising. "This is my country. People like you don't belong here." That was it. A young woman near the bread aisle gasped audibly. The quiet murmurs of the crowd grew louder, but Daryl remained composed. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't move closer. Instead, he let the silence stretch, allowing her words to settle in the ears of everyone around them. "All right," he finally said, nodding slowly. His calmness was unexpected, almost unsettling in its quiet strength. "Let's talk about that, since you brought it up." The store seemed to hold its breath, waiting for his next words. The storm was coming, but not in the way anyone had anticipated. Darryl shifted his weight and carefully set his basket down on the floor. His composure had a gravitational pull, drawing everyone in, even those who had tried to ignore the unfolding scene. He fixed his gaze on the woman, not with anger, but with a quiet determination that made her shift uncomfortably. "All right, you said I don't belong here," Darryl began, his voice steady but firm. "But let me tell you something about where I come from." Each word carried weight, deliberately chosen. "My great-great-grandfather was born in Mississippi," he continued, pausing to let the words sink in. "He was a sharecropper, working land he didn't own, breaking his back so his children might have a better future. His father? He was a slave, kidnapped, beaten, and sold like property. And for what? To help build the very country you're standing in." The elderly woman's lips pressed into a thin line, but she remained silent. The crowd, however, was captivated. A man near the dairy section, who had been distracted by his phone, put it down completely. An older couple exchanged hushed whispers, but kept their eyes fixed on Darryl. "My grandfather," Darryl went on, his voice gaining strength, "fought in World War II. He risked his life for a country that sent him overseas, only to treat him as less than human when he returned. He couldn't sit at the same lunch counters, couldn't drink from the same water fountains. But he stayed. Do you know why? Because he believed in this country's promise, even when it didn't believe in him." A hush fell over the store. Even the low hum of the refrigerators seemed to fade. "And my parents," he continued, his tone softening but losing none of its intensity, "they fought too. Not with weapons or fists, but by working hard every single day, raising me to believe in kindness, respect, and integrity. My mother is a teacher. She's spent her life helping children, no matter where they come from or what they look like. My father is a mechanic, the kind of man who wouldn't hesitate to stop and help someone like you if your car broke down." He let the words settle before speaking again, his gaze never leaving hers. "So, you're telling me I don't belong here? That I should go back to Africa?" He shook his head slightly, his voice now tinged with sadness. "Ma'am, I am just as much a part of this country as you are. Maybe even more, because my family has paid for it in blood, sweat, and sacrifice." The elderly woman's face flushed, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched her apples. She parted her lips as if to respond, but no words came. They caught in her throat before she could utter them. Darryl took a step back, his composure unshaken. "I could have walked away," he said, this time addressing the entire crowd. "But what good would that do? Ignorance doesn't change in silence. It's on all of us to do better, to rise above words like those." His words lingered, heavy in the air. But the story wasn't over yet. The crowd's reaction would speak louder than anything else. For a long moment, no one moved. The silence that followed was almost deafening. The elderly woman's expression was a mix of emotions, anger, embarrassment, and something deeper. Something that looked almost like shame. She scanned the faces around her, as if searching for someone to take her side. No one did. Then, a middle-aged man wearing a baseball cap stepped forward. "He's right," the man said, his voice breaking through the stillness. "We have to be better than this." It was as if a spell had been broken. An older woman near the frozen foods aisle nodded. "My father fought in that same war," she said softly, her voice trembling. "He always told me the only color that mattered was the red in the flag." The murmurs grew. A young cashier, barely in her 20s, called out from her station, "I've never seen anyone handle something like that with so much grace. Thank you." The elderly woman, now visibly flustered, clutched the handle of her cart. She didn't apologize, but the fire in her eyes had faded. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter, almost uncertain. "I didn't mean—" she started, then trailed off. Darrell turned back to her, his expression softer now. "It's not about what you meant," he said gently. "It's about how it came across. Words matter, but actions matter even more." From the deli counter, a slow clap broke the tension. Hesitant at first, but then others joined in, the applause swelling into something undeniable. They weren't just clapping for Darrell's words. They were clapping for the courage it took to meet hate with dignity. The elderly woman cast one last glance around the store, her face pale, before silently wheeling her cart toward the exit. As she walked away, a few people approached Darrell. A woman placed a hand on his shoulder and said, "Thank you for saying what needed to be said." Darrell smiled faintly, lifting his grocery basket once more. "Sometimes," Darrell said, almost to himself, "it's not about winning or losing. It's about making sure people hear the truth." The crowd slowly began to disperse, the tension in the air giving way to quiet reflection. Some looked inspired, others thoughtful, but no one remained unchanged. The moment had passed, but the impact of Darrell's words lingered. As people returned to their shopping, the atmosphere in the store felt different, quieter, more introspective. Darrell finished picking up his groceries, his steps measured, as if absorbing the weight of what had just happened. Though he remained composed, he couldn't shake the feeling that something important had taken place. At the checkout, the young cashier who had spoken up earlier scanned his items, her expression shy but appreciative. "What you said back there?" She hesitated, then continued, "It meant a lot. People don't always stand up like that, especially with such grace." Darrell offered a warm smile. "Sometimes grace is the only way to break through," he said. "Anger just builds walls." Outside, the sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the parking lot. As Darrell walked toward his car, he noticed the elderly woman sitting in hers, gripping the steering wheel tightly. For a brief moment, he considered walking over to her, but then he stopped. Some lessons take time to settle. He had already said what needed to be said. That evening, Darrell sat at the kitchen table with his father, recounting the day's events. His father, a man of few words, listened intently, his hands folded in front of him. "You did the right thing, son," he finally said. "Not just for yourself, but for everyone who was watching. People like her. She might not change overnight, but you planted a seed. That's all you can do. Plant the seed and let it grow." Darrell nodded, his father's words resonating deeply. He realized that while the encounter had been uncomfortable, it had also been necessary. Ignorance doesn't change unless it's confronted, and silence only allows it to spread. Across town, the elderly woman sat at her dining table, staring at the untouched plate of food before her. Darrell's words replayed in her mind, each one cutting through the armor of her long-held beliefs. She thought of her grandchildren, of the world they were growing up in, and for the first time she felt something unfamiliar: doubt. In the days that followed, word of what had happened at the grocery store spread through the neighborhood. People talked about Darrell's response, his courage, and the dignity with which he had handled the situation. It became more than just an incident. It became a lesson, a reminder of the power of words and the importance of standing up for what is right. Darrell never sought attention for what he had done, but his actions sent ripples through the community in ways he hadn't expected. Strangers approached him to share their own stories of prejudice and resilience, thanking him for saying what they never could. His quiet stand had sparked conversations that had been avoided for too long. And the elderly woman, she too began to change. It wasn't immediate, but she found herself questioning the beliefs she had carried for so long. She didn't know if she'd ever see Daryl again, but if she did, she hoped she'd have the courage to apologize. Moments like these remind us of the power of kindness, strength, and truth in the face of ignorance. They teach us that standing up doesn't always mean shouting. It can mean speaking with quiet conviction and letting the truth do the rest. To everyone watching, let this be a reminder. Your words and actions matter. They can hurt, or they can heal. They can divide, or they can unite. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Together, we can spread messages of hope, courage, and understanding to build a better world.